Delighted to be with you all, with those in the room and those online. Congratulations to MLN for organizing a conference of this kind and attracting so many people to it, because boy, is it the right time for us to be focusing on some of these issues today. And I guess that's what I'm here to focus on in my opening comments. There'll be time after I've spoken for some Q&A, as you heard from Kevin, so do please think ahead to that and anything you'd like to ask me. I hope to cover many of the biggest issues that I can in the first 20 minutes, but it's a big, big agenda. And as you know, we're all wrestling with trying to make sense of what we've learned recently about accelerating climate change and about the impact of that on people's lives and what the implications of that are for business. And obviously, this is an event that goes right to the heart of the contribution that business can make to this transition story. We're all involved in it, but there's a focus today in particular on what the business community can add to it. And I was reminded of that yesterday when I read a big new survey just published that showed that there has been a real stepping up on the part of business in terms of commitment to doing something about climate change. More and more companies all around the world are now expressing their intent. But the survey was rather more disappointing when you actually got to grips with what is happening as a consequence of that changed mindset. And not enough is happening. Less than a third of those companies that have already indicated a willingness and intent to act have followed through with specific action plans, with real hard-edge, time-bound commitments to make stuff happen. And as you all know, anybody involved in business or in running civil society-type organizations, you know perfectly well that if there aren't time-bound action plans of that kind, it ain't going to happen. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that today. I know that you'll be hearing about those kind of priorities from my good colleague, David Gavigan, who is also speaking here today, and of course from Chris Martin from Danske Bank, who knows a bit about what that must look like. I was last in Belfast nearly 3 years ago and was able then to bring some of these big climate issues to the fore in a big event at Clayton Hotel. 3 years is a long time in terms of accelerating climate change, and I was just reflecting on that pace of change. If you take a period of time like that, 3 years, and you think about what has happened. And of course, what we've seen is that when people talk about climate change as something we need to address in the future, the last 3 years should have disabused us of that fantasy once and for all. The frequency, the intensity of climate disasters today just goes on getting worse. And I was recently reviewing a rather extraordinary list of these climate disasters, put together, I might say, by an insurance company, because that's one sector in our economy today that is beginning to feel this pain in a very, very direct and real way. And that list of disasters just gets bigger every year, and the cost gets bigger every year, and I'll come back to that. And that, of course, has all been confirmed by the latest report from the government advisory body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A report signed up to, incidentally, by every single government in the world, including some improbable suspects like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, all the bad guys, if you like. So this report came with the imprimatur of all the governments that fund the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, described by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, as a report indicating code red for humanity. So I'm hoping that everybody involved in this call now is in a code red mindset. We don't have the luxury of being anywhere else right now. And the report, in very chilling terms, spelled out exactly what code red really means, with red light signals flashing at us extremely brightly. Essentially, as you know, we've been trying to do the required to ensure that the average temperature increase over the rest of this century stays below 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's been the goal since the Paris Agreement back in 2015. Well, the Code Red report says that we're likely to hit an average temperature increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade by the middle of the century, by 2050. We're at 1.1 now, and what that means is we'll see 0.4 of a further temperature increase over the course of the next 30 years. The implications of that are again spelled out very clearly in the report. There's no beating around the bush here. It goes into a lot of detail as to what we can expect as a consequence of that warming, additional warming, now being injected into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation and all the causes that we know extremely well. This report, for me, and I have been involved in this for a long time, was pretty extraordinary because it used language that I've never heard the Intergovernmental Panel use before, a completely different tone to the report, including several references to what it calls irreversible climate change. Now, that's where we need to just buckle up and understand the implications of that. When it comes to two big things, and it talks about ocean acidification and rising sea levels, the report says we have already caused irreversible changes in those two huge ecosystems, if you like, sea level and ocean acidification. And it talks about these changes being irreversible, quotes, over hundreds or even thousands of years. We've already done that. That's locked in. And whatever happens between now and 2050 and between now and 2100, that will just compound that damage already done. And what that amounts to is a minimum of a 1 meter sea level rise, average sea level rise by the end of this century, with a very real probability of it being as much as a 2 meter sea level rise. Now, I promise you I'm going to stop talking about all this grim stuff in a moment. But I just do have to start as an event like this by reminding everybody what Code Red means. Possibility of a 2 meter sea level rise by 2100. So just dwell on that for a moment. From the perspective of an 18-year-old today, we know that politicians are only too keen to talk about what they're going to get done by 2050. And I don't want to be too cynical about this, but they're particularly keen about that date because they know they'll all be dead by then. So they really don't care about much of the stuff that needs to happen. But if you're an 18-year-old today, by 2050, you would normally expect to be in the prime of your life, as it were, enjoying an opportunity to use all your skills and talents to the full, to ensure a good life for oneself, family, community, others, etc. And if you think ahead to 2100, a lot of 18-year-olds will still be alive in 2100. So they're contemplating a world completely devastated by an average sea level rise of 2 meters, completely devastated. Now, I'm thinking about this because you're going to be hearing later today from Emma Rafferty, Northern Ireland's climate ambassador. And I think you'll hear that voice of young people. And I want you to mark it because it's one of the few ways in which we're going to start changing how we process this information about climate change. We've heard this stuff for a long time. It goes in, it sits there for a bit, we worry about it, and then we get on and do what we would otherwise be doing. So mark that voice. It's different, it's important, it's game-changing, I think, for adult populations that know what they really should be doing. But if you also think back over the same 3-year period, we've also learned a huge amount about the solutions that are available to us, because this is not just a really gloomy story. We are beginning to see the available solutions coming through the system, through new investments, new ways of thinking about energy and transport and manufacturing and farming and so on. These solutions now are all around us. It's actually impossible to keep track of the ways in which new technology, new systems, new processes, new use of data is beginning to transform the overall scene. And that's hugely exciting, hugely exciting. Starting, of course, with the massive breakthroughs in renewable energy, particularly electricity, where we've seen solar and wind power just become the absolute go-to places now for new investment. We know we're on our way out of the age of fossil fuels. We know that. The only question is, how long will it take? So the speed of uptake in the world of renewables is really critically important. And you can see that in all sorts of ways. So we also know that the internal combustion engine is essentially on death row. Here in the UK, one of the very few decisive, clear decisions taken by this government is to ban the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. That is a death sentence for the internal combustion engine. Please don't have any doubts about that. And what it means, of course, is all the car manufacturers are massively ramping up their investments now in electric vehicles, and in particular in battery technology. Another huge new announcement earlier in the week from Ford Cars in the USA. We're talking tens of billions of dollars to transfer the entire car production system out of petrol and diesel into electric and still hybrids. Now, we have to be careful here. I don't want people to get too excited about the transition to electric vehicles, because frankly, we ought to be thinking much more deeply about different ways of providing for people's mobility and transport needs. Yes, it's going to be better to have electric vehicles on our roads than to have petrol and diesel vehicles, but it is still a technology that imposes a massive footprint on planet Earth. And that is why I was so pleased to know that the Lord Mayor, that Kate Nicholl will be talking in her speech a bit about Sustrans. I've been a patron of Sustrans for a very long time. And what is so important about that perspective is it takes us beyond just the private car. And it takes us into this much more exciting world where we can think about integrated transport systems based, yes, of course, on improved facilities for cyclists, pedestrians and so on, improved public transport, absolutely critical, but also using all the new technology available to us to move away from the private ownership of a car to car clubs, car sharing schemes, often at a community level, which let me be optimistic here, in 10 to 15 years' time, should make it completely unnecessary for people living in towns and cities even to think about owning a private car. I say towns and cities a little bit harder when you look at the needs of people who live in rural areas. It's a bit of a tougher challenge in that regard. So beyond the technology, we have to think about the lifestyle changes, the community demands that we need to think about. And we have to think about it through the lens of what is often referred to as a just transition. And I want to just devote my last few comments to this notion of a just transition, because this is absolutely at the heart of what we should be thinking about today. I was listening to the Today program on Radio 4 earlier with a very interesting piece about the impact of rising gas prices on different parts of the UK economy. And of course, the impact of this falls disproportionately on those with lower incomes, often living in poor quality housing, who are, as it were, facing a perfect storm. And I use that phrase advisedly because I also had a chance this morning to look at a very powerful document from the Northern Ireland Fuel Poverty Coalition, a new manifesto for warmth, which was launched earlier in the year. You'll all be much more expert in this than I am, but you know that Northern Ireland has a particular burden when it comes to fuel poverty. It has some of the highest rates of fuel poverty anywhere in the UK, almost twice as high as in England itself. And you will also know that people living in fuel poverty are often paying at least twice as much for their energy as people living in well-insulated homes. This is a form of injustice that I think we need to bring right up the agenda for change. And of course, COVID has made this a great deal worse. Impact on the economy has made it a great deal worse. Rising energy prices now are going to make it a great deal worse. And that's what Fuel Poverty Coalition and National Energy Action were talking about when they talked about a perfect storm coming this winter. Now, there's absolutely nothing abstract about this. There's nothing airy-fairy about this. This is a challenge in our faces right now. It is a social justice challenge as much as it is a climate challenge. It's exactly the kind of thing that we should be addressing as a top priority to avoid what Greta Thunberg so eloquently described as 3 decades worth of blah, blah, blah. 3 decades worth. We've known about fuel poverty in the UK for at least 3 decades worth. Over the last 10 years, 11 years with this government, we've had various schemes brought forward, all of which have pretty much been designed for failure, all of which have totally missed the point about fuel poverty. And we face a continuing crisis around this today. We know that the costs of climate change are already being borne by people here in the UK and by people all around the world. And we cannot allow that to continue. That takes us to a rather interesting phenomenon in our midst at the moment, which is the impact of a small organization called Insulate Britain. And I imagine that some of you will have been following the news story about Insulate Britain, an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion, made up of some very dedicated and courageous campaigners who have decided that the only way to get government to focus on the issue of fuel poverty is to disrupt the motorway network, essentially around London in the first instance with the M25, and to go on doing this until such time as the government makes a firm, time-bound commitment regarding what it will do to eliminate the scourge of fuel poverty across the UK. Their cause, Insulate Britain's cause, is absolutely right. It is cruel and cynical to allow fuel poverty to continue as a huge issue in our society. Personally, I think their tactics are completely wrong.